Hello, Brain Damage Philosopher here, and in this video I want to discuss the multiverse a little bit. This is probably going to be a shorter than average video, but I think it's still worth making. And here's why. Theists often bring up the multiverse as the only possible atheistic response to the cosmological and fine-tuning arguments. They bring it up as the only response, and then they attempt to demonstrate how it's silly and has a lack of evidence, or is too science fiction-y, or just generally doesn't have any more evidence for it than the God hypothesis, and thus having demonstrated the only possible other conclusion that their arguments could lead to is ridiculous, they assume contentedly that the listener is now convinced that the God hypothesis is the only valid conclusion that their arguments could lead to. Of course, the problem is that the best they can do in order to demonstrate the ridiculousness of the multiverse hypothesis is, first, to say that it's an atheist fallback, the final option that atheists have come up with in order to explain a universe without God. Of course, the problem with saying this is that fallbacks are sometimes the argument that finally works. Right? Just because something is a fallback doesn't mean the argument is invalid. If it can explain the same data, if it is internally coherent, then it's a valid response no matter how it was actually arrived at. The second problem is that the best they can do to generally demonstrate the silliness and arbitrariness of the multiverse hypothesis is to say that, one, it's unfalsifiable, and two, there's no evidence for it. But of course, the God hypothesis falls to the same claims. So, of course, the multiverse and God hypotheses are actually on equal footing. They are just stressing the flaws of the multiverse hypothesis and glossing over the identical flaws in the God hypothesis and relying on the intuitions of their listeners, who, having been brought up in Western society, likely view the multiverse as a science fiction invention and God as something that might really be real because of cultural osmosis. They're relying on that intuition to convince people to go with the God hypothesis over the multiverse hypothesis without actually examining the relative merits. Because even if the multiverse and God hypotheses are on equal footing, that doesn't mean that you should select the God hypothesis, right? That's the definition of them being on equal footing. And of course, I don't actually think that they are on equal footing. Because for all the protestations that religious people make that the multiverse is a religion too, although it is unfalsifiable and not verifiable, it posits no supernatural mechanisms. It posits no interferences or suspensions of the natural order within our universe. It posits nothing that contradicts the evidence that we currently have available to us and the strong inductive priors against the supernatural. Thus, it is not religious. It is, at best, simply philosophical speculation. So even on those grounds, they cannot accuse atheists of being hypocrites by accepting an, quote, atheistic religion instead of accepting God, because it's not a religion. So the atheist choice is between the multiverse hypothesis, which is a philosophical speculation at worst, and the God hypothesis, which is actually religion. Whereas the theist would like to present it as an atheist making a choice between two religions while claiming they're not religious. But furthermore, if the multiverse and God hypotheses are on the same footing, right, which I believe at the very worst they are, and they both explain the same data and are a valid response to the same arguments, I cannot see why a theist could condemn an atheist for choosing the version of an explanation for these arguments that doesn't include a God. Because the only criticism that they could make of that is that, it's somehow a priori good or better to believe in a God, which again is relying on intuitions gained through cultural osmosis. But I actually think that, laying aside the fact that one is a religion and one is a philosophy, that the multiverse hypothesis is not actually evidentially on the same grounds as the God hypothesis. Because while the God hypothesis carries with it a gigantic metaphysical commitment in the form of a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind, The multiverse hypothesis instead carries with it simply a multiplication of entities which we already know exist, and in essence is simply a rejection of the hubris of the idea that there can be only one example of this thing that we have. Moreover, while the multiverse is entirely internally consistent, and consistent with all of the evidence we see in the fact that there are no supernatural interventions that we can demonstrate, the God hypothesis is inconsistent with what we see, as I described before, but it is also probably internally inconsistent. For instance, a mind requires sequential thoughts, building on each other and coming to decisions and so on. This is part of what we mean when we say a mind. Yet how is this possible without time? Furthermore, I'm not sure what it would mean for something to be a disembodied mind. This seems to also posit an entire new type of ontological structure beyond the material, on top of positing the gigantic metaphysical commitment of a God in the first place. So now we have the metaphysical commitment of a God and the metaphysical commitment of a supernatural realm and substrate within which minds can exist. Furthermore, we have to now posit the interaction between something that is inherently non-material and something that is material, which is again a gigantic metaphysical commitment. So again, additionally, not only is the multiverse a very small metaphysical commitment to make and consistent with everything we see, whereas the God hypothesis is a gigantic metaphysical commitment, internally incoherent, and possibly inconsistent with what we see. Furthermore, the multiverse hypothesis is an extrapolation of some of the most foundational and predictive theories in science, including quantum mechanics, general relativity, and the different explanations we have for spatial expansion, and as well as quantum. There's something else, but I forgot. I recommend you check out Sean Carroll on this. But so not only is it an extrapolation of sorry, I lost my train of thought. The multiverse hypothesis is an extrapolation of our best and most predictive scientific theories, whereas the God hypothesis is nothing of the sort. It's completely unrelated. It's posited only to explain the answer to these two arguments, the cosmological and the fine-tuning arguments, whereas the multiverse hypothesis does explain those, but is actually generated through a study of the physics and cosmology of our universe, and so is far less post hoc, because instead of being specifically designed to explain what we see, it simply does happen to explain what we see, but has been arrived at through other means. And those other means also add much higher priors in favor of the multiverse hypothesis. Furthermore, I actually think that the multiverse hypothesis predicts what we actually see in our world via the fine-tuning argument far better than the God hypothesis does. Because while the God hypothesis can be made to explain anything because of how vague and complex and contradictory it is, and so can be fit to explain what we currently see, even though this is not, even though we would actually expect most naturally from it a universe that is far more habitable to human life, and where human life began far earlier in the universe, and so on. The multiverse hypothesis, meanwhile, predicts instead that the vast majority of universes would be uninhabitable. Of the habitable ones, the vast majority would be barely habitable. And then, the smallest minority of universes would be ones that are maximally habitable. And so it predicts with, if we're selecting out of the ones that just end up habitable via the anthropic principle, because we wouldn't notice if we ended up in an inhabitable universe because we wouldn't develop in the first place, it predicts with the highest level of probability a universe like the one we see, which is merely minimally habitable, where 3/4 of our planet itself is technically not habitable, and the vast majority of the universe isn't. Whereas, and it only predicts with the least probability a universe that's maximally habitable, Meanwhile, again, a God hypothesis is the reverse. It predicts with the largest probability a universe that is maximally habitable, and with the least probability a universe that is barely habitable. So, let's make a T-chart and compare. The multiverse has a very small metaphysical commitment. The God hypothesis has a very high metaphysical commitment. The multiverse is internally coherent. The God hypothesis is very probably internally inconsistent. The multiverse hypothesis does not contradict any evidence that we have confirmed, whereas the God hypothesis requires a contradiction of natural laws, and therefore contradicts the evidence that we have. The multiverse hypothesis is an extrapolation of very well attested to scientific theories. The God hypothesis is no such extrapolation, and is fact just posited post hoc. The multiverse hypothesis just happens to explain or predict a universe like ours as a byproduct, which is how predictions should work, whereas the God hypothesis is constructed post hoc to explain the world we live in. And most tellingly of all, the multiverse hypothesis predicts with a very high certainty that we would live in a minimally habitable universe like the one we see, whereas the God hypothesis predicts with the highest certainty a universe that we don't exist in, and only secondary certainty as a result of its massive flexibility, a universe like the one we live in. This is quite telling. On basically every possible count that way that you could judge a hypothesis, the multiverse hypothesis is leaps and bounds better. So not only are theists misrepresenting the multiverse hypothesis as simply a religion just like theirs, not only are they relying on our intuitions to make that mean that we should choose the God hypothesis over the multiverse hypothesis, they are also misrepresenting it by stating in the first place that they are on an equal footing. All that said, however, I don't actively believe that the multiverse exists necessarily. I think there are other valid explanations for what we see that require an even smaller metaphysical commitment and make no statements about what is outside the observable universe. I think it's entirely possible, perhaps even somewhat more than a 50% chance that there is a multiverse, based on the relative merits of it as a hypothesis, but since it's completely unfalsifiable and especially unverifiable and could have no bearing on my actual experience of the world and any pragmatic matters, I don't assert it with as much certainty as I do almost anything else. So since I got through that quite rapidly, at least on the scale of the videos I usually make, I also want to make a small digression into the tactics of apologetics. You see, it's interesting that theists and apologists especially so desperately want to portray the situation as of them having a strong and time-tested stable of rational arguments that they can deploy at any moment at will against atheists, and atheists are fighting a losing battle against these arguments, where they're having to come up with new last-ditch hypotheses that are more outlandish, each new hypothesis more outlandish than the last, in order to fend off the conclusion that there is a God. Because in reality, what it is instead is that all of these arguments for God's existence have been around for several hundred years. And oftentimes, their refutations were released within a few years, a few months, or a few days of their original construction. And these refutations have been known to be valid within academic philosophy and, within the general, philosophical community since their inception, and have been regularly deployed by atheists almost to the point of these objections becoming rote against these apologist arguments. So instead, the reason why, these arguments that apologists have keep coming back is not because, they're time-tested and true and irrefutable, but because apologists merely refuse to acknowledge that they have been refuted. You see, the stupidity of your interlocutor is not evidence that you're not actually winning the argument. Someone can refuse to acknowledge that your rationality, right, without that making them correct or rational. And that's exactly what's happening with apologetic arguments. They've been refuted over and over, with refutations accruing over the centuries, but theists just refuse to acknowledge it. And all of the new hypotheses that atheists construct are either the result of further research or being bored with repeating the same refutations over and over, not a move of desperation. Also, again, I should note that even if they are a move of desperation, that does not mean that they are not valid. This also sort of explains why there's a somewhat cyclical nature to apologetics arguments. For a while, a certain set of apologetics arguments will become very popular, and then a deluge of atheist and agnostic and sometimes even religious refutations will arrive, usually just pulling from the stock set of refutations that have been around for almost as long as these arguments. And then Christians will realize that these arguments aren't very strong and give up and move on to new arguments. And so the refutations of the old arguments will fade out of memory. New refutations will arrive for the new arguments. And so they'll give up the new arguments because of the new refutations. And by then, the refutations for the first set of arguments have faded out of memory. And so they'll just pick up the first set of arguments again, and then refutations for the first set will arrive, and so on and so forth. It's literally the wheel of time, but with Christian apologetic stupidity. And obviously they need to hide this, because it's a pretty obvious pattern once you start looking for it, right? And so they need to make sure that Christians who hear these apologetics and they want to use them think that there is no credible refutation and that atheists are scrabbling to come up with new objections to these arguments, right? Because otherwise, they're not going to want to use them. The closest thing, so, I don't know. This video is one that's sort of been on my mind for quite a while. I wish I could delve more into the actual physics and science of this, but, due to my condition, that's quite difficult. So, I recommend you just, look it up for yourself. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for listening. Bye.